Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our special joint webinar with managing partners from both sides of the border. We have Canadian Practice Director Evan Green and U.S. Practice Director Jonathan Grode. As you know, the title of our webinar is H-1B or no H-1B, what are your options in Canada? And we are going to answer this question for you as best as we can. So please feel free to ask any questions via the pop-up text bar on the right side of your screen, and we'll do our best to address them at the end. If the panelists do not get to your question, you can contact them through the information provided at the end of the webinar. With that being said, I'll hand things over to our panelists.
Thanks, Danielle. So I think we should start today by basically, Jonathan, the Minister of Immigration on June 27th announced a wonderful new program in Canada. And based upon the announcement, it is for current H-1B holders. So why don't you explain what an H-1B is and who holds those visas?
Right, so H-1B is your, oh, and Evan, it's great to hang out with you here today. So I always like that. But H-1B visas are your standard working visas in the United States. And it's predicated on a very simple test. Does the position require a degree, or is there a degree, does the position require a degree, and does the individual have a degree related to the field of endeavor? And realistically, for years and years and years, these have like flown very easily, very, very smoothly. But come the pandemic, a number of things happened, and it's been building for years. First, it's really hard to get them. But where this program is particularly aimed at is the fact that the majority of H-1B visas are held by people who work in the tech sector. And the tech sector has shed a number of jobs over the course of the last, let's say, 9 months or so. So you have a lot of people in H-1B status who are looking for new work in an environment where they're super saturated with individuals who are unable to find work. And whilst many H-1B visa holders have been able to move from a layoff posture to a new employer, there are a number that are very talented who aren't able to secure employment. And I think what this program is looking at is saying, hey, if you've had an H-1B and you've got a skill set and you're not able to find a new job, we have a way for you to come to Canada. So whilst it would be great if this program was a bit larger, if it would take advantage of the people that like tried to get an H-1B visa this year and were cut out because of the numerical limitations associated with the H-1B classification. And I think that that would have been a smart play. This is looking at your more seasoned professionals who are between jobs or looking for another opportunity, or maybe to say, hey, why not Canada?
Right. So under the announcement, it's supposed to take effect this Sunday, okay? That's when you're supposed to be eligible to apply for work permits in Canada. What we're not clear about is any of the rules, any of the regulations, and who it qualifies for, because they haven't come out with any. The only thing that they've said is that it's supposed to start on Sunday, and it's a 10,000 slot position. What my thoughts are, and sort of the question I have is, so as a technical question to you, Jonathan, I've been laid off, okay? So I'm part of Meta. I was laid off. I was laid off in February, but I'm still in the United States on H-1B status. Is that a valid H-1B?
So it's a very interesting situation because you are actually given from your, let me take 2 steps back. There's 2 things you have to be mindful of, and the U.S. government has like given us some clarifying guidance on this. But essentially, you have your day of separation and your day when your employment stops. And the way a lot of these companies are, for a variety of reasons, like notice period requirements under state law or whatever, you're getting severance. So you actually have to look at like when your regular payroll stops. That's the signpost that USCIS has stated. And then from where your regular payroll has stopped, you have a grace period. And that grace period is 60 days. Once you get past that 60 days, technically you're accruing unlawful presence. And the United States has some very archaic methodologies for assigning penalties associated with overstay. Specifically, if you overstay your status by more than 6 months, you can't come back to the U.S. for 3 years. If you overstay for more than a year, you can't come back for 10 years. So it is a 3-year, 10-year bar. It's pretty harsh. You can get tricky. So what ends up happening is a lot of these people in that posture that you're talking about, Evan, are actually forced to go into a visitor visa classification from H-1B if they're unable to find work. This Canadian solution or other options with moving to Canada provide a methodology of keeping your employment authorization whilst you seek out other opportunities, or maybe of a pending green card, that kind of thing.
No, so the program, as announced, said on July 16th, 10,000 slots for family members. It's not just 10,000. 10,000 principal applicants will be available. And under what we know is you have to hold H-1B status to apply. Now, it could change, but that's what the announcement said. And what I think is going to happen, especially given, what you've already spoken about, Jonathan, is that a ton of H-1B holders are going to apply in this program because there's no downside to applying. Like there's no, as far as we know, it's good for 3 years, the work permit. So in essence, it's, something you apply for, obtain an approval, and put it in your pocket. And then for the next 3 years, if you have employment issues in the United States, you can say, I got a work permit. Let me come to Canada, right? When you're applying for jobs. It's not as if you actually have to move. And I think perhaps maybe one of the reasons why there's been delay on the regulations is the government has figured out that they may have missed the mark on this program. And, perhaps it should have been directed at people in STEM, with STEM degrees who weren't selected in the lottery. Because if you're working in the United States, there's no impetus to move, okay? Unless you've got some sort of better offer in Canada. In essence, I think they're going to get 100,000 applications on the first day, because what's the downside? And most of those people, if not all of those people, are not going to come to Canada.
Well, and you can tell just from the queries we've been getting.
Yeah. Right.
I'm an H-1B holder. I'm currently working. What's the deal with this Canadian program that I'm hearing about? People like protection.
For sure.
And that's the way I agree with you. The majority of folks are looking at this as an insurance. I do think
I'm doing the program. Yeah, I'm doing the program. I make it for U.S. STEM grads who weren't selected in the lottery, and C, have a job offer to Canada. Because otherwise, everybody and their cousin's going to apply for this program as a security measure and put it in their pocket. We see it all the time, sort of in permanent residence, when it was easier to get permanent residence for Canada. People applied for it, obtained it, and then we get the questions, oh, I've been living in the United States in H-1B status for the last 5 years. How do I keep my Canadian PR? Because I've never really moved to Canada. So the one thing I want to stress on this call for people is we don't know the rules and regulations yet. They haven't come out. And anybody who's telling you, give me money, I know what the rules are, I'm going to guarantee you entry, we don't know that yet. We don't, and they shouldn't really be doing that. The only other thing I can sort of talk about is where we've had other oversubscribed programs in Canada. For instance, the parental sponsorship, which is oversubscribed when it comes out. What the government has done is given, sort of like the H-1B program, a 30-day period in which you could put your name in, and then the government would write back to you and say, hey, yes, you got a slot, now you can apply. They may do that here, because as I said, I think they're going to get more than 10,000 applications on the first date. So bottom line, stay tuned.
Interesting. Right. And I will say you got to be really careful, because I've seen some Canadian practitioners saying that you can use it for people that haven't been selected in the H-1B lottery. So
we don't know that.
There should be a little bit of trepidation and care, for sure.
Yep, for sure. So bottom line, stay tuned, and we'll have that up, once we get the regulations. And there might be a pushback on this too, now that they've realized what they've announced, and saying, hang on, maybe we'll amend it in some way. So that is as much as we know about the new program for H-1B holders. So the impetus of this seminar is really what's happened to those people who weren't selected in the lottery. What can you do with those people? And Jonathan, maybe you want to give a little bit of a background in terms of the lottery, how it works, who gets selected, and how that's played out this year.
Yeah, happy to do so. So the H-1B has an annual limit of 85,000 new H-1Bs a year, not people that have like done it, in the past, and you only get counted against the lottery once, but essentially there's 85,000 spots. 20,000 of those are set aside for people that have earned a U.S. master's degree or higher in a STEM field. So essentially you got 85,000. Okay. And progressively, ever since 2012, the cap has been met, meaning that there's more applicants than there are spots available. And you used to, back in the day, you would just pop in the petition. Those that didn't get selected would get returned. And there was a bar to applying because you would have to go through all of the effort to actually make the application. Under the Trump administration, they changed to a lottery system. Pretty much putting in a lottery ticket is not expensive, not time consuming. A lot of people, similar to what we're talking about, this Canadian program, just pop it in even though they might not actually qualify. And what happened is we've seen a huge exponential growth in the amount of actual applicants who are applying for this lottery, to the point where people had multiple employers, petitioning for many beneficiaries. And this year we had nearly 800,000 lottery tickets submitted for the 85,000 spots. Now, where it gets really odd this particular year is we actually expected there to be better availability because of the previously discussed layoffs in the tech sector. Last year there was 400,000, more or less. So we saw a doubling. In May, the US government comes out and says, "Oi, we've noticed some irregularities with the way the lottery was done." To the point where they say that of the people that applied, over half of them are double applicants, meaning the same individual had multiple petitions filing. Anecdotally, we've heard a lot of weird stuff, like fly-by-night companies being set up, charging foreign nationals a lot of money to actually submit a lottery ticket on their behalf. The system is essentially broken, unfortunately, and wrought with a lot of fraud. That has created a mistrust of employers in particular with this program, which is honestly like the foundation bedrock for non-immigrant visas in the United States. So it's become a huge issue. So yeah, I really wish that we had a better answer here. We are expecting some things to happen, like they are trying to suss out the fraud. They are trying to see what they can do. We are expecting a second lottery to be run where the people that did win multiple times will have their numbers put back into the pot, and hopefully in August we'll have a new lottery. But I'll be honest with you, I've been doing this work now since 1999. This is by far the worst I have ever seen it, ever. And I don't know, it's the nimbleness for which the US government is creating this situation is providing an opportunity for Canada. And that's really the way we got to look at it as a North American law firm. Oh, I think you're muted maybe. Did you mute yourself?
I am unmuted.
There you go.
Okay. So if I haven't been selected in the lottery, there are some options both in Canada and the United States that we want to talk about. So the first one, of course, is the Canada Express Entry System. And what that is the permanent residence program. And it's a points-based program where you get points based on your age, education, language, work experience in and out of Canada. And that's sort of the basic tenets of the program. And then there's bonus points that you can get. with that, the government typically does a draw every 2 weeks or so, and they will select a number of applicants based on who has the highest scores in the program. In addition, if you haven't got Canadian work experience, you're under a different category, which is called a federal skilled worker. You need to have at least 1 year full-time foreign skilled work experience to qualify. And it's very difficult, in fact, under our system to qualify if you don't have Canadian work experience. You just don't get high enough points in terms of who is selected. So, I mean, the ideal candidate would be a 30-year-old PhD with 3 years of foreign work experience who is fluent in English. They will score the highest that you could possibly score, and it may still not be enough. Now, recently, what we've seen is a movement to draws based on your actual occupation. So if you're in the IT space, they did an IT draw last week, which was really much ado about nothing so far, because the points were still sort of at a level where you couldn't qualify if you weren't in the country, and very high, like maybe 1 point below the previous general draw. So that's why I say much ado about nothing. However, later in the week, they did a healthcare draw for the healthcare occupations, and those occupations were about 20 points lower than what we've seen. So we'll see how it plays out. The one area where we've seen a big points drop and specific draws in the last 2 weeks have been the bilingual applications, or people that just speak French. Those people were selected at a much lower point level than we've seen in quite a period of time. But sort of the general...
I guess the question really is like, if you're doing a consultation with somebody, is your first stop always express entry? Like, is that what you're...
That's for PR, but usually what'll happen is we'll start with PR and say, okay, you've got 450 points. We've got to raise your points. And how do we raise your points? You got to work in Canada. You got to get a year of Canadian work experience to qualify. Okay. So that's sort of how we start. Okay. To see, because Canada, unlike the United States, wants people to become permanent residents. Okay. That's the big difference.
You know, it's kind of funny, I would say, and this is something I talk a lot about with colleagues, because the H-1B system is so broke, there's actually more of a push towards permanent residency now, with them modifying the rules and allowing like for better things with national interest waivers. And we are pushing more towards a green card over non-immigrant system. You know, fundamentally, I don't necessarily agree with. I do think you should, you know, with the ineptitude of Congress, unfortunately, that's what we're left with. But conceptually, we should be favoring a system which has a non-immigrant to immigrant flow. It's more logical. But anyway, yeah, it's I know we're meant to talk about it a little bit later, but if we're talking about like the H-1B being an absolute dire situation, the U.S. government has actually made it easier to get something called a national interest waiver, which is a stepping stone to a green card. And, you know, pushing some of these advanced degrees is automatically qualifying. So it's a very bizarre time from like a pure legal perspective. Like, you know, you guys announced these programs. There's no federal register entry. There's no wait time. There's no notice and comment period. If you want to do it, the Canadian government is extremely nimble when it comes to
Absolutely.
Sometimes I think it creates the problems you're talking about with this program, where they don't know how to implement it because they haven't gone through notice and comment and thought about it.
They haven't thought about it.
The flexibility is incredible.
Yeah, that's certainly there.
We from a legal perspective, we don't have a lot of levers to pull to do something quickly.
Yeah. So let's go back to sort of the non-immigrant in Canada, where we have people who haven't been selected and need to leave. So we do have the IntraCompany Transfer visa available, and especially for the STEM grads who haven't been selected in the lottery, The basis of the intracompany transfer to Canada is that they've worked in the U.S. for at least 1 year of the previous 3 and are currently employed, okay? And they're going to transfer to the same organization in Canada in a specialized knowledge position. And we do a lot of those where people haven't been selected in the lottery, but the requirement is that you need at least a year of employment abroad. Now, Canada also has a very interesting category under the global mobility section, I would say. And where you're working for a company that has similarly employed Canadians abroad, it's almost a reciprocity type scenario. So if I have people, Canadians working in the US, okay, I can argue that as part of our global mobility program as a company, we need to bring in Mr. Grode. He's got 6 months of experience. He's been identified as a leader. We're going to throw him in this program. We want him in Canada for an 18-month period. And that would allow for eligibility for the L1 to come back. So maybe talk about the L1 and how that works coming back after you've been in Canada for a year.
Yeah, and this is what a lot of larger companies are doing, or even smaller companies are looking at this. Like, first of all, you got these 2 concepts. Like, with the advantage of remote work and technology and everything, you've used this term a lot, but we have this concept of nearshoring, you know, where there's like an advantage to somebody operating in the same time zone and being able to serve clientele because the majority of work has moved online, or a lot of it can be done online without much interruption, notwithstanding the push to return to the office, right? So theoretically speaking, if you ultimately want to end up in the United States, or the company ultimately wants you to end up in the United States, and they have an overseas entity in Canada, you can be transferred from the US to Canada. And if you log a year of employment in Canada, and it has to be physically present outside the United States, it doesn't have to be consecutive, but it does be cumulative, a year of physical presence outside the United States, you can be eligible to be transferred back to the United States. And that visa classification is called L. There's 2 flavors of L. There's managers and executives. And then there are the people that have specialized knowledge, which is really like a legal term for proprietary knowledge. A really important note, especially for those that are Indian or Chinese nationals, doing a year abroad in a managerial capacity, if you are able to do so. So let's say you do your 3 years of STEM OPT, you didn't get selected in the lottery, company's looking to send you to Canada, they pop you up there in a management role. Transferring back into a management role creates a fast path to a green card. So there's a dual advantage taking use of the intercompany transfer, where not only can you activate a non-immigrant visa, but for those that have per country limitations that result in very long wait times for the green card, this managerial play can actually accelerate your ability to become a permanent resident. So, you know, it's an interesting play. A lot of companies are saying, you know what, if you're young and we're trying to build a global culture and we really want to be able to promote this global entity and identity, it's almost to our advantage to send somebody overseas for a year and then bring them back. So it is becoming way more popular. And again, Canada creates some avenues where you can do it.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Now, the other program which we use sometimes, and we sort of throw it, it's one of the ones where we throw out because you never know, is Canada has a francophone program whereby the government of Canada is trying to create more bilingualism outside of the province of Quebec. So where the job exists outside the province of Quebec, and the individual speaks French, and they actually just drop the levels a little bit, so it's an intermediate level of French, they can get a work permit for skilled occupation. So what happens is, if the person has been educated in French, then prima facie, that's fine. We can show things that way, French national, but sometimes you're always surprised by the people who actually do speak French. And we would get them to take a test with the scores on the test being at a high enough level and a job offer in Canada, they can enter anywhere in the country outside the province of Quebec, and the job itself does not require French as part of its role, but rather you just have to have the French language and you're good to go. Okay, so Jonathan, we can get your mom a work permit for Canada. She's coming in
May we
because of the
say
French.
bon.
C'est bon.
C'est
Okay,
bon.
so that's
Okay.
an option, and you always ask for it. The next one, the next bullet point I'm going to go down to is the IEC, which is the International Experience Canada. And what that is for Canada is Canada has multinational agreements with many countries throughout the world to allow for students to come to Canada for periods of time. And for any people who have ever been to Whistler, this program is typically used by the Australian community to work and ski for a 2-year period in Canada. But it's country specific, it is quoted, and it is limited in duration. It could be a year, like for instance, Italy, it's a year, and each country has its own rules. So we have to be very careful that the individual does qualify in the IEC. And the visas become available typically in January, and they are quoted, it's country specific, but it is something that we do look at. And student, when I put that in quotes, a lot of the countries, it's under 36, so 35 and under. Some countries it's 30. We have to look and see. But it is an opportunity for some people who weren't selected to get into Canada, and sometimes they get an open work permit. Sometimes it's tied to a company. Lots of different options. Okay, there. And
wow.
Yeah, the last sort of point that we look at and what we would call sort of the path of most resistance is the LMIA, the Labor Market Impact Assessment. And that's where there's a job offer in Canada and they prove that there's no Canadian available to do the job. There is special IT programs. We don't have time today to go through them, but within the LMIA space, you generally have to advertise, but in the IT space, you don't. You just have to agree to certain things with the government. Now, we will often get requests from individuals who, let's say, don't have a presence in Canada, and through an organization, they're being told they can get me a work permit in Canada. And it's tricky, it's possible. You really do need some good advice here before you go down that path.
And it take a while too, right? I mean, these
takes, well, I would say under the LMIA category in the IT space, they're supposed to respond within 2 weeks on the LMIA, okay? Then if the individual needs a work permit, they have to apply for the work permit. And if they're in the US, the processing time has gotten a lot better. I would say probably an additional 6 to 8 weeks. So within 3 months, they should be able to get their work permit. But it's a very technical thing where you don't have an operation in Canada and you're sort of using a third company provider. But I would tell you to be careful with that and get some legal advice. So let's switch hats, shall we say, and what options are there to keep these non-selectees in the US?
Well, we don't have the plethora of optionality that Canada is currently providing.
It's always been the kinder, gentler place, right?
Yes, it's a nice place. We do, as mentioned, a couple of these we've already talked about, Evan. We did chat about the second H-1B lottery that we hope to see. We should get notice of that sometime in the end of the month, and that should run in August. If you are in that H-1B lottery, you don't need to reapply. You're automatically put into the next round, so that's good. I think it's going to be a robust second lottery, just given the amount of issues that we saw, that we discussed about the fraud, the double applications, etc. There is something called Day One CPT. These are interesting. These are typically master's programs where they allow you to do work whilst you're attending school. It does have to be full-time enrollment, but master's programs are generally less arduous when it comes to hour requirements for classroom time, and a lot of people do that. So you do maybe a 1 or a 2-year master program that allows you to continue to work for your employer while you wait for the next H-1B lottery to roll around. We talked about that L visa, the long play with the L, where you're outside the United States for a year. The one that a lot of people look at, especially if you have an advanced degree in a STEM field, you've published, you've presented, you have a lot of notoriety around yourself, and these are very hard for young people, Evan, in particular, but there is O1 classification for extraordinary ability. But the one which is actually giving some hope and some encouragement is the national interest waiver. And the national interest waiver, Evan, is a green card petition. It is not a non-immigrant visa, but in January of 22, the White House came out with a memo via the USCIS, which is the Internal Immigration Service, which ostensibly said if you have a PhD in a STEM field or an advanced degree in an emerging technology, and they have a list of what they consider to be emerging technologies, that's prima facie evidence that your occupation and your work is within the national interest. That mechanism, that designation, is actually one of the few ways that you can self-sponsor for a green card. And this standard change that this administration put out is really a game changer in your ability to use it. Now, it's fraught with challenges in terms of numerical limitations and timing, and it's not a substitute for somebody who's on their last go at getting an H-1B or was recently laid off. But it is something that we look at and are examining. The other thing I would just mention about this national interest waiver mechanism is that it's a policy memorandum. And we talked a little bit about jurisprudence today, which was kind of interesting, but policy memorandums can be taken away just as easily as they're written. Very unfortunately mindful of the fact that it's all good and fine and good with this administration. The next administration might not be as friendly. They can take it away. They can deny the cases that are currently pending. So it's something that it's something that we are using a lot right now because we got another 18 months more or less of this administration at a minimum, but it's something to monitor. I see it more as like a window of time as opposed to something that's going to have like long enduring benefit, like a regulatory based program. We were very fortunate as a firm to be connected with Amy Nice, who was the architect of this program. Excuse me, when she was at the White House. She's since left the White House and she's a fellow at a university, Cornell, but she wrote an article with us on this very topic, and you can find it under our, what's it technically called, but the e-alert area on the webpage. You can find that article, which talks in more detail about that program and how it can be used.
Okay. So I have a question for you. Sure. On the CPT, okay? I'm taking a master's program that allows for CPD, okay?
CPT,
yeah. Will that take away from my employment authorization when I graduate?
Great question. So you only get authorization to work after graduating from a course if you go up a level. So that's the first thing. Okay. So if you go bachelor's, master's, and then day one CPT, master's, you're not getting OPT afterwards. Okay. Secondarily, if you do more than 364 days of full-time work while completing a degree, the government's position is like, "Oi, you've already got your training. Why do you need more training after graduation?" But people use the day one CPT not in pursuit of a future OPT, Evan. They use it as a bridge to get to apply to H-1B again.
Yeah. Okay. And other than that, I think that the key sort of takeaway in our program today is there are options available to people. There really are.
There's a ton of options. I mean, we joke about the size of the border that we're on, but I am extremely jealous by the nimbleness which the Canadian Immigration Service shows. We talk about this a lot, but on a fundamental basis, Canada has embraced immigration as a means of expanding its economic prowess. And
For
the
sure.
results are in. The population is growing substantially. I mean, what did you tell me last time? You just clicked over 40 million people in Canada?
Correct.
I mean,
Last month.
you know, when you're looking at the size of a market going from 1/10 of the United States to 1/8, that's substantial. That's
Right.
substantial. So it's obviously working. And now with remote technology and meetings and nearshoring, the advantages could not be more ripe for the taking.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I
No.
encourage Canada. Great.
Yeah, in the minister's announcement, one of the other things that we're sort of waiting on, we don't have there's no real guidelines on remote work, but they're supposed to come out with them. And included in the minister's announcement was a nomad visa and how that would work. So there's lots of options, but we're waiting for details. And, for those people in this circumstance, keep in tune, keep online, and we'll be happy to update people at the time. So I think we're good, Jonathan.
Yeah, I didn't see any
Okay.
questions come through. That's because we answered them as we were going.
There we
But,
go.
Evan, it's
Danielle?
good to hang out with you. I appreciate Danielle putting this together for
Yeah.
us. And, yeah.
Okay.
See you on the next
Danielle, back to you.
Perfect. So I also don't see any questions. So if you do have questions or if we're missing anything, I'm sorry if I can't see it. We're having some problems with that. But thank you everyone for joining us and attending today's webinar. Special thanks to Evan and Jonathan for sharing their expert knowledge. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to discuss today's topics in more detail or ask questions that we missed, you can find their information on the screen now. And please reach out and book a consultation on both sides of the border. I also encourage you guys to sign up for alerts and follow us on social media. This way you guys can keep up to date with the latest developments regarding Canada and the US immigration-wise. And once again, thank you for joining.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.